We have a picture of the medieval knight. He wears shining armor, he rides a powerful horse. He carries a lance and a shield with his family's coat of arms. He is a symbol of courage, honor, and chivalry. He fights for his lord, for his king, for God. He is a hero. This picture is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. It leaves out the mud, the fear, and the simple, brutal business of war. And it leaves out what happened when that knight failed. When a knight was knocked off his horse, when his sword was broken, when he was surrounded by enemies, he faced a choice. He could fight to the death. Some did. Or he could surrender. For a knight, surrender was not the end. It was the beginning of a new uncertain chapter. He was no longer just a warrior. He was now a captive. A captive was a commodity. The moment a knight surrendered, his life changed. His value was no longer in his fighting skill. It was in his wallet. A captured knight was a walking treasure chest. His armor, his horse, his weapons, they were all valuable loot for the common soldier who captured him. But the knight himself was the real prize. He was worth a ransom. This single fact shaped everything that came next. War in the Middle Ages was not just about politics or religion, it was also a business. And for many, it was the main way to get rich. A successful battle could make a man wealthy for life. And the quickest way to wealth was capturing an important enemy, a rich duke, a powerful baron, or even a king. The higher the rank, the bigger the payday. This meant a captured knight was an investment. You had to keep your investment alive and in reasonably good condition. A dead knight was worth nothing. So, the first thing that usually happened was a negotiation on the battlefield itself. A knight would surrender to another knight, not to a common foot soldier if he could help it. He would offer his gauntlet as a sign of submission. He would give his word, his parole d'honneur, that he was now a prisoner. The captor would accept. This was a formal, almost polite transaction in the middle of a bloodbath. The captor now owned the prisoner like a piece of property, but ownership was complicated. A simple soldier who captured a great lord couldn't just keep him. The prize was too big. His own commander would step in. The soldier would be paid a finder's fee, maybe a very generous one. But the valuable prisoner would be passed up the chain of command. The king or the top general would take control of the most important captives. Their ransoms were a matter of state, not just personal profit, so the captured knight was disarmed. He was led to the rear of the battle. He was now out of the fight. His immediate survival was more likely than it had been moments before. But his future was completely out of his hands. He was waiting to see who his captor was, waiting to see how much he was worth, and waiting to find out if anyone back home was able and willing to pay the price for his freedom. The romance of the knight was gone. The reality of being a prisoner had begun. He was no longer a hero. He was a piece on a chessboard waiting to be moved or sacrificed. Ransom was the engine of medieval warfare. It was a system built on a strange mix of honor, greed, and practicality. For the captured knight, his entire future depended on this system working in his favor. Stressful and incredibly expensive process. First, a price had to be set. There was no price list. A knight's ransom was not a fixed amount. It was based on his perceived wealth and status. How much land did he own? How many castles? What was his title? A simple knight might be worth the value of his horse and armor, maybe a year's income from his estate. A baron was worth much more. A duke or an earl could be worth a fortune, enough to fund a whole new army. The king was the ultimate prize. When King John II of France was captured by the English at the Battle of Poitiers, his ransom was set at 3 million gold crowns. It was an impossible sum, equal to twice the entire yearly income of his kingdom. The negotiation was a slow dance. The captor would start high. He wanted to get as much as he possibly could. The captive's family would receive a letter delivered by a messenger who could take weeks to arrive. The news would be a shock. The family had to prove they couldn't pay the initial demand. They would plead poverty. They would describe bad harvests, political troubles, anything to lower the price. Letters would go back and forth. This could drag on for months, even years. All the while, the knight sat in captivity, his fate being debated by others. Who paid the bill? It was rarely simple. The knight was expected to contribute from his own wealth. But few had enough cash on hand, so they turned to their families. Wives would sell their jewelry. Heirs would take out massive loans. Land, the source of all wealth and power for the nobility, often had to be sold. A single ransom could cripple a family for generations. Sometimes the knight's lord or king would help. It was a lord's duty to help his vassals. But there was a limit. If a lord had dozens of knights captured in a bad battle, he couldn't afford to bail them all out. The knight was often on his own. One of the most remarkable parts of the ransom system was parole. If a knight was considered honorable and trustworthy, his captor might release him on parole. This meant he gave his sacred word of honor that he would return by a certain date with the money. He was allowed to go home unguarded to raise his own ransom. It was a huge risk for the captor. What stopped the knight from just staying home? The answer was the chivalric code. A knight's honor was his most valuable possession. If he broke his parole, his reputation was destroyed. No one would trust him again. He would be an outcast in his own society. Other knights would shun him. He might even be disowned by his own family. The shame was considered worse than imprisonment or even death. So, most knights who were granted parole did, in fact, return if they couldn't raise the full amount. They would go back into captivity rather than live in disgrace. But the captor also had responsibilities. He had to treat his high-value prisoner well. This was not about kindness. It was about business. A sick or dead prisoner was bad for business, so a captured duke might be held in a comfortable room in a castle. He would eat good food, similar to what his captor ate. He might be given books to read, or even be allowed to hunt or exercise under guard. He was treated like a guest, albeit one who was not allowed to leave. The goal was to keep him healthy and in good spirits, so his family would be more motivated to pay up. A miserable, dying prisoner was a less valuable asset. The entire system was a cold calculation of risk and reward, all wrapped in the language of honor and nobility. The ransom system worked most of the time. It was in everyone's interest for it to work. The captor wanted his money. The captive wanted his freedom. But sometimes it failed. And when it did, the knight's world shrank to the size of a room, a cell, or a tower. He entered a long, bleak period of imprisonment. What was this imprisonment like? It depended entirely on two things: the knight's own importance and the character of his captor. Our modern image of a medieval dungeon is of a dark, wet, rat-infested hole. For some, this was the reality. A low-ranking knight with no powerful friends, or one whose captor was cruel or poor, could find himself in exactly such a place. He would be chained to a wall, he would be fed scraps of bread and dirty water. Disease was a constant threat. The cold would seep into his bones. This was a miserable existence, and many did not survive it. But for a high-ranking noble, things were often very different. A captured duke was a valuable asset, not a criminal to be punished. His captor had to keep him alive and well, so his imprisonment might look more like house arrest. He would be given a private chamber in a castle, perhaps with a fireplace and a decent bed. He would be served good meals and wine. He might be allowed to receive visitors or write letters. He could pass the time playing chess or reading. It was a gilded cage. He was comfortable, but he was not free. The door was locked. Guards stood outside. He was under constant watch. The psychological toll of this waiting was immense. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. The knight was cut off from his life, his family, his duties. He heard nothing of the negotiations for his release, or he heard only frustrating news of delays and disagreements. Hope would rise and fall with every new rumor. The boredom was maddening. There was nothing to do but wait and think. Men would grow despondent. They would lose their health not from bad conditions, but from sheer despair. The uncertainty was a form of torture in itself. Imagine being a man of action, a warrior used to riding, hunting, and fighting. Now, your world is four walls. You have no control over your own life. You are completely dependent on the mercy of your enemy and the financial efforts of your family far away. It was a recipe for mental collapse. Some knights tried to escape. This was incredibly risky. A failed escape attempt could mean being moved from a comfortable room to a dark dungeon. It could mean being put in chains. It could even mean death. But for some, the risk was worth it for a chance at freedom. Most, however, simply endured. For the captor, a prisoner who couldn't be ransomed became a problem. He was a mouth to feed and a body to guard. He was taking up space. What was the point of keeping him if the money was never going to come? The captor's patience would wear thin. He might sell the prisoner to someone else, hoping they would have better luck collecting the ransom. Or his attitude might change. The well-treated guest could suddenly find his conditions worsening. The good food would stop. The comfortable room would be taken away. This was a tactic to put pressure on the prisoner and his family, a way of saying, pay up or things will get much worse. When the money dried up, so did the hospitality. The long wait could easily turn into a slow, grim decline towards a forgotten death. When ransom failed and imprisonment dragged on, a captured knight faced much darker possibilities. The polite business transaction of war could break down, replaced by brutality and cold political calculation. A knight's life, once a valuable asset, could become worthless or even a liability to his captor. This is when things got truly dangerous. Execution was a real risk. Why would anyone kill a prisoner who might one day be worth a fortune? There were several reasons. One was pure politics. Killing a prominent enemy leader could send a powerful message. It could demoralize the other side. It could eliminate a rival permanently. A captured knight, who was also a known rebel or traitor against his own king, had little hope of being ransomed. He was likely to face a swift trial, if any, and a public execution. His death was a tool of state power, a warning to others. Revenge was another motive. War was personal. Knights fought the same opponents in battle after battle. Feuds between families could last for generations. If a knight captured an enemy he truly hated, one who had perhaps killed his brother or his father, the desire for vengeance could easily outweigh the desire for profit. In the heat of the moment, or in a cold, calculated act later, a captor might simply murder his prisoner to settle a score. The most famous example of mass execution happened at the Battle of Agincourt. King Henry V of England had captured a large number of French knights. Suddenly, the French launched a surprise counterattack on the English camp. Henry was in a tight spot. He didn't have enough soldiers to both fight off the new attack and guard the hundreds of prisoners. He feared the captives would rearm themselves and attack from behind. He made a ruthless decision. He ordered his men to kill the prisoners. Many English knights refused. Killing a noble captive for whom you hoped to get a ransom was against the entire code of chivalry and business. It was like burning money, but the king's order was absolute. The common archers, who had no stake in the ransom system, carried out the grim task. It was a pragmatic, brutal choice, and it shows how quickly the rules of war could be abandoned when survival was on the line. Another dark fate was being sold into a different kind of servitude. In the wars between Christian Europe and the Muslim world, like the Crusades or the conflicts in Spain, the rules were different. A captured knight might not be ransomed back to his home. He could be sold in a slave market. He would be forced to work as a laborer, perhaps rowing in the galleys of a ship or quarrying stone. His armor and title meant nothing. He was just another strong body to be put to work. This was a complete loss of identity, a fall from the highest rank of society to the very lowest. And there was perhaps the saddest fate of all being forgotten. This happened to the knights who were not important enough for a great ransom, but too poor to pay a small one. Their families might have tried to raise the money and failed. Their lord might have died or simply lost interest. The war moved on. New battles were fought, new prisoners were taken. The forgotten knight would be left to languish in some provincial castle's prison. His captor might have died, and the new lord of the castle might not even know who the prisoner in the tower was. He would grow old and gray in his cell, his name and his story lost to time. He wouldn't die a hero's death on the battlefield or a traitor's death on the scaffold. He would just fade away from disease, malnutrition, or old age, alone and far from home. For the knight, who was lucky enough to be ransomed, his return home was not always a happy ending. The ordeal was over, but its consequences could last a lifetime, affecting not just him but his entire family line. And over time, the very system that defined his capture and release began to change, eventually fading into history. The first and most immediate consequence was financial. Ransom was ruinously expensive. A family might have to sell off manors, forests, and fields that had been in their name for centuries. This meant a permanent loss of income and status. They might have to borrow huge sums from merchants or moneylenders at high interest. This debt could hang over the family for generations, each heir inheriting the burden of the last. A knight returned home free, but he might find his family impoverished and his children's inheritance gone. The price of his life was his family's future. There was also a personal cost. The knight himself was changed by the experience. The years in captivity could break a man's health. The poor food, the lack of exercise, the damp conditions, all could lead to chronic illness. And then there was the mental toll. They didn't have a name for it then, but we would call it post-traumatic stress. The knight had faced defeat and helplessness. He had lived with constant uncertainty and fear. He might struggle to readjust to normal life. Some historical accounts describe formerly great warriors who returned from captivity as quiet, withdrawn, or overly cautious. The trauma of their imprisonment stayed with them. The world also moved on without them. A knight who was a prisoner for 5 or 10 years would return to a court that had new favorites, new alliances, and new politics. His position might be gone, his lord might have a new right-hand man, his own lands might have been mismanaged in his absence. He had to fight all over again, not on the battlefield, but in the political arena to regain his standing and influence. This whole system of personal capture and ransom began to die out as the Middle Ages came to an end. Several things caused this change. First, the nature of armies changed. Kings and states started building professional, standing armies. Soldiers were paid a wage by the government. They were employees of the state. A prisoner was no longer the personal property of his individual captor. He became a prisoner of the state or a prisoner of war. The state would handle negotiations, which were often about mass exchanges of prisoners rather than individual cash payments. The business aspect for the common soldier disappeared. The second major change was technology. The arrival of gunpowder and firearms on the battlefield was a great equalizer. A musket ball or a cannonball did not care if you were a duke or a peasant. It killed indiscriminately. Armor became less effective. The heavily armored knight on his horse was no longer the king of the battlefield. Warfare became more impersonal and much deadlier. It was harder to take a wealthy person prisoner when a battle was being decided by volleys of gunfire from a distance. The chivalric code itself also began to wane. The new style of warfare had less room for ideas of personal honor between combatants. As the world moved towards the Renaissance and the modern era, the old medieval structures of feudalism and chivalry began to fall apart. So the fate of a captured knight tells us the real story of his time. It was a world caught between ideals and reality. The ideal was the honorable warrior whose life was governed by a code of conduct. The reality was that this warrior was also a financial asset, a piece in a brutal game of profit and loss. His capture was not just a military event, it was an economic one. And his fate, whether he was ransomed, imprisoned, or killed, shows us that in war, survival has always been a complicated business of chance, money, and power.